Good evening. I'm Greer McGeary, President of Seahorse Victoria. My guest tonight, Duncan Reid, who is an Anglican priest and has a very interesting story to tell about inclusion in society. Welcome, Duncan.
Thank you, Greer. Thank you for the invitation to be with you.
One of the things about before we get into taking on a ministry is what influences from your early life led you down that path, or what was your early life like?
Well, it was fairly standard suburban Melbourne. I grew up in Caulfield, so there was already a cultural diversity in that part of the world, because many of the kids I went to school with were Jewish. I'd been brought up in a Christian and Anglican home. I suppose I was always interested in difference and people who were different from myself. I remember, for example, being at the age of 6. This tells you how old I am. The Melbourne Olympic Games, being taken to the Olympic Village with a brand new autograph book to get autographs from all these famous athletes. And I expect you can't do this nowadays, but at that stage you could just wander into the Olympic Village and talk to people. And I remember at that age not being satisfied, because Australia was pretty white in the 1950s, and all the athletes seemed to be just as white, and I wasn't satisfied till I met a tall brown man in a turban and got his autograph. I realised it was a Sikh turban, but I didn't realise then. But that was exotic enough for it to be interesting to me. So
very young experiences there. So going through primary school, you said, you mix with a lot of different backgrounds and the like. So did you find just sort of being a middle of the road sort of student, or
yes,
social sort of aspect?
Yes, it was. I just thought of that as normal. What I grew up with was normal, and I suppose it was fairly normal at the time, except that it was probably more culturally diverse than some Melbourne suburbs. I remember the first, effectively a refugee family who came from Hungary after the 1956 rebellion in Hungary, came to our street. Though what I didn't realise, of course, that many of the Jewish families were themselves, relatively recent immigrants in Australia.
Well, as a child, you wouldn't really know that, would you?
No, that's right.
Because you've all turned up at school at the same time.
Exactly right.
Well, I grew up in the Riverina area of New South Wales, and we had names of Polish names and Hungarian names, and that coming to the school then. But likewise, though, it was very white, the Aboriginal communities that lived around the town were always on the outer.
Yes. Your question about inclusion for this conversation started me thinking about my own experiences of when I've felt included and when I haven't felt included, and also something I'm less comfortable with, things when I've made other people feel not included, and that's not something I'm proud of, but that's part of.
Well, we'll touch on that as we go through.
Sure.
You're moving from primary school into secondary school. Sort of, what was that like for you as well? So just that sort of, It was something that's happening.
Yes, it was. Going from a small pond to a big pond, I suppose. I had a very privileged secondary schooling. I went to a private Melbourne private school, which the thing that was most significant for me there was learning languages. Actually, I did German and Russian at school. Once again, it was learning to see the world through a different lens, if you like, once you start
Because
learning.
that's an interesting combination of languages. I think
Yeah,
I
yes.
was learning good and bad English. It's about
Well, yeah. I mean, I know it's very. It was.
yeah.
I feel very
Well,
privileged to have had
Latin
that.
and French at secondary school, but
Yeah. Yes.
up
Well,
until that point,
it's the same sort of thing. It's
yeah,
still
yeah,
you do see the world differently when you
that's
study.
right.
And I was lucky to have a. I mean, I guess my favourite teacher was the language teacher. In my whole secondary schooling. So
Secondary school there, I gather it was a religious school, was it?
it was, yes.
How involved were you, in, say, the church activities while
Yeah.
just being at school?
My family went to church fairly regularly, not probably not every Sunday, but had grace at meals. I do remember being taught to pray by one of my godmothers as a very small child, and it was for me. Church going was a good experience. It was it was a community. It was very much a community experience in the 1950s, early 1960s. So again, I saw it as completely normal. I was aware that other people went to other kids went to other churches or to the local Jewish synagogue, but it was a centre of community life.
Well, in some ways, that's how I've thought of religion. I
Yeah,
grew up in a
yeah.
Catholic family and
Sure.
Catholic primary and secondary schools, and while I was about 15 when I came to the conclusion that if there was such an entity as a God, well, no such entity, but it was if there was the thing, it'd be described as the sum total of human knowledge rather than a being.
Yeah, yeah,
But I always felt that religion was a sort of a two-part function. The rules by which the community lived, and that close-knitness to make this. Because we're talking going back thousands of years, you've got to survive, you've got to
sure.
look after each other, and then the God function was a bit of a controlling mechanism.
Okay. Yes.
Is sort of how I thought about it.
Yeah. Okay.
But that doesn't mean that the values, as opposed to dogma, and that's what I've sort of feel that even though I've sort of drifted away from believing in a God, that the actual values that was taught were contained in the words and deeds of Jesus didn't always match up with the dogma of the ruling authority.
That's unfortunately true in all churches. I took a bit longer to get to that, to ask that question. I guess it was about second year university. I was going to church quite regularly still, and finding that an important part of my life. Not simply with my family, but I was taking myself there as well. In fact, I'd moved out of home. I was taking myself there, but I came to a point where I thought, this is all either a lot of nonsense, or else it is the claims of Christianity are so crazy that it's worth taking with absolute seriousness.
Yeah.
No, it had to be one or the other. It couldn't be.
Yeah. So going through secondary school, you've had that sort of, I won't say casual, probably a bit, just what was seen as the standard of going to and from church and religious teaching. So what university course did you originally?
I did art. I went to university on a studentship, which was Victorian government policy at the time, where the education department would pay for all the fees, and but the student would make a commitment to teaching for 3 years, and there was a shortage of teachers. And so I committed myself to that, and partly because I couldn't think of anything else. I did talk to to a school careers advisor, who basically said, well, what have you thought about doing? And I said, well, I've thought about teaching. And he said, well, good idea. and that was about
subtitle of the
language teacher, who I considered my favourite teacher at secondary school, did write me a letter after I'd left school and said, you've chosen the best possible career. You've chosen the most worthwhile possible career.
So you've done your arts degree and you've
Yeah.
done some teaching. What was sort of the social life that you were having, and how did that have an influence on where you ultimately go to?
Yes, I taught in the country for a year. Lived in two different share houses. As a student, I'd been involved in the student Christian movement, so I was sort of, it was more committed than simply going to church every Sunday. And the SCM was setting up a share house about the time I moved back to Melbourne, and I was involved in organising that or helping organise it. And so I moved into a place in Fitzroy for another 2 years. I should backtrack a little bit and say, the student Christian movement was very important to me, partly because I found there people who wanted to identify as Christians but were asking serious questions, the same sort of questions that I was. And of course the big question in the early 1970s was the Vietnam War.
Yes.
And I mean, I remember spending far too much time not studying but trying to work out whether I was a pacifist or not. And talking to people about that question, because that was the existential question that I was faced with because of conscription, of course. I mean, I was balloted out of the
same here.
Yes.
My number never came out.
but it was a really serious question, and in the end, I came to the conclusion that I wasn't a pacifist, but it took me probably 2.5 years of thinking, reading, talking to people to come to that.
What was the progression to finally making the decision to become a priest?
Okay. In many ways, it was a sort of intellectual decision. Well, it was emotional in the sense that the church and this student organisation did give me a very strong sense of community, and the share house in Fitzroy was part of that. I mean, I'm still friends with the people I shared a house with in Fitzroy in 1974, 75. We still, we keep in touch with each other. And this parting of the ways that I mentioned before, either Christianity is nonsense, just crazy, or else something deserving absolute taken seriously. I chose the second of those paths. I thought this is so outrageous. These claims are so outrageous that I've got to understand what they're all about. I can't just plod along and not think through what these things mean. So by the time I left the arts course and started teaching, I actually wanted to do theology. I wanted to study theology, not necessarily for the purpose of working in the church, but of understanding what it was all about. What's the doctrine of the Trinity about? What's the incarnation about? How to make sense of these things. And I started doing some study as I was teaching, especially even in the country I did it by correspondence and then back in the city. But by the end of my 3 years of teaching, I really wanted to study theology full time, and at the same time I was thinking, well, what am I going to do with this?
So, in a sense, it sounds like almost an academic exercise in a sense, with some sort of longing to do. You're not sure where to take it.
That's right. Yes, that's very much the case. In a way, that's remained with me. I need to sort of understand, but also, to be fair, the more I read and talked with people and thought about it, the more sense it made to me. It was not making less sense; it was making more sense, and especially in terms of community and diversity and inclusion. All of those things seem to fit.
So you've been doing your theology degree
and
full time,
2 years full time,
full time. Where did you see it going once you've actually completed the degree?
during the course of this process, before I finished teaching, I think it was before I finished teaching, yes it was, maybe I do need to check what the church has to say about this, what my own Anglican church had to say about it. And so I put myself forward for a selection conference for the which is the hurdle you've got to jump to be ordained. I went into it with the attitude, well, this will be another parting of the ways. My church authorities will either say, yes, we want you to work in the church as an ordained priest, or they'll say no. And I thought, I will take whatever answer I'm given. I'm not going to come back a second time. And they said, yes, we want you.
So how long was the study to be an ordained priest?
It was 3 years. It would normally be 3 years at that stage.
While studying, did that throw any doubt?
No, it didn't actually. I chose subjects that really suited my quest, my sense of searching for wanting to know more. Another remarkable teacher who I came across in theological college was Harry Wardlaw, who's a philosopher of religion or philosophical theology, he'd call it. I did all of the courses he was offering, and he was offering things like 19th century thinkers.
Studying the sort of theological philosophy.
That's right. Yes, and that was raising these questions. And I don't think criticism of religion or Christianity in particular has progressed much past Nietzsche. Nietzsche said it all in the 19th century. I don't hear any new arguments.
You get to be ordained as a priest.
Yep.
You go from being allocated to a parish, I presume, as a curate.
Normally, at that stage, it was 2 curacies of 2 years each. And I was agreed to go to the country for my first curacy of 2 years. During that period, I decided to get married. So that was, I met my wife, my future wife. And also there was a shortage of clergy in Gippsland, country Victoria. And
well, I think that's fairly widespread.
Yes. Anyway, after 18 months, the bishop asked me to go into a parish, on my own, which is very short notice. Yeah. It's much more normal now, but that was not normal then. And I said, look, I've agreed to go back to Melbourne. I said I was coming for 2 years, and I didn't want to get out of touch with Melbourne. So I went there for 6 months to a single parish.
Now that you've sort of got some experience in that, now what are the aspects of being a priest that you were feeling? We've talked about you're really impressed by being in community, being part of community. What are the things of community that really spoke to you now that you hear somebody is a leader in a sense of community?
Look, it's actually quite a lonely job, I discovered. You're very much on your own, and that was true both in the country and coming back to the city. But you meet wonderful people, people who are part of the church community, but also, especially in the country, lots. When you're working in or living in a small country town, you get to know the full range of people.
That's right.
And that's terrific. I really did enjoy that. You're meeting people also at crisis points in their lives, at times of death, at times of new life, especially if a baby is born sick or something like that.
While we've spent time sort of talking about your development to be a priest, and the philosophy, what I'm sort of now interested in is how you applied all of that background to all this diversity. Now, I met you when you were at St Stephen's in Richmond as the locum priest. in dealing with such a wide range, a place like Richmond, we
Yeah.
know from the injection room, so there's drug addicts,
Sure.
there's people from all the alphabet
Yeah,
communities and things that you're dealing with, and as well as the regular parishioners that you have, families. How did you apply all of what's led up to that?
Just by being myself, really, in the end. Just, not trying too hard to prove anything to anyone. Just visiting people, talking to people in the street. When I came back to Melbourne, I was in North Melbourne, so I'd lived in Fitzroy for 2 years and was part of the community there. North Melbourne, the church was right next to the Housing Commission flats, and I saw it as part of my job, just going around the flats, talking to people, knocking on doors, to whoever would open the door, and which you could do in those days. Yeah. It's a bit more difficult now.
Would you sort of say that you were a preachy type of person, or more?
No, no, not really. I mean, I actually had a very good sort of collaboration in North Melbourne, where every week I met with the Uniting Church minister at the time, and who's still a friend of mine, and we would look at the readings for the coming Sunday, and then discuss them, and we worked quite hard on them, and then went away and wrote our respective sermons. We never showed the sermons to each other afterwards. We were always going forward. But that was a really valuable thing, because it meant I was continually engaged in a practical conversation. What am I going to say next Sunday? Yeah. And what's going on in the world this week or this month? So that was part of it as well. And I think I've retained that. I've retained. And I guess the other thing I'd have to say is I did always try to speak to the people who were actually there in the pews. As I got to know people and their particular needs and questions, I tried to be mindful of those things.
Yeah, because like you're touching on one of the things that I speak to trans people that contact me is learning just to be comfortable with yourself and being yourself.
Sure.
Because that seems to be the key for people reacting to you better. Because if they see you, that's genuinely you. You're not pretending to be something else.
No.
So how does that sort of, in your hindsight, as it were, do you sort of see that you're able to fulfill that sort of just being yourself and being there for somebody?
I hope so. I hope I was able to do that. I'm sure not everyone. Well, I mean, none of us ever know the impact we have or don't have on other people. But I certainly hope that was the case, that they saw the genuine me, not some sort of facade.
One of the challenges that we sort of see, particularly, it is in Australia as well, but you sort of see particularly some of the extreme sort of actions from places like in America, where they say, we're doing Christian things, and yet they're book banning, they're criminalising parents who seek help for their children and things like that. How is that sort of, having studied your philosophy and your teaching, or prior to getting into the church, being a teacher of schools, dealing with people on a day-to-day basis, as well as then on Sunday you're trying to convey a sense of the word, as it were. The application of it.
Yeah. Look, I can't explain how other people read the Bible differently from the way I read it, but it seems to me that it's about inclusiveness all the way through, and surprisingly so. when I was on the way here, I was thinking, a simple example is the Book of Ruth in the Old Testament. It's only 4 chapters. It's a very short story about a foreign woman going to an Israelite village and trying to make her way in this village as a foreigner, as an outsider, at a time when and a place where foreigners and outsiders were not readily accepted, and it tells the story. It's a very beautifully written story, and then the very last bit of the story says, and by the way, I'm paraphrasing here. By the way, Ruth was the great grandmother of King David. Okay, so right there in that story, which is sort of embedded in the Old Testament, there's this the greatest hero of ancient Israel has a foreign woman as his great. I think it's a great grandmother.
Well, distant, direct line relative. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. So I mean, you get little hints like that there's a sort of opening up of the world that goes right through the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, I think. Yeah. And as you say, Jesus is a very obvious example.
I don't ever remember being taught that he said it was okay to hate or to be spiteful,
no,
to be violent.
No.
So, Duncan, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.
It's interesting to hear your story, but the way in which you applied yourself through your religious career, as it were, to helping others through inclusion is really what we would like in the LGBTI, but particularly trans community, just like to be treated as a normal human everyday being.
Yes.
So thank you very much. I'm Greer McGeary. My guest has been Duncan Reid. Thank you for watching.